Hello and welcome to ICA in Conversation that broadcasts on the second and fourth Wednesdays of each month. My name is Tim Tyler and I'm delighted to lead this conversation where we're going to be talking about organised crime at an international level. Before I do that though, can I remind you, or if you haven't joined us before, tell you perhaps for the first time, that we've got the opportunity to pick up on any questions or observations that you might have. So can I encourage you, please, to raise them using the comment section on the LinkedIn Live event page. This is going to be organised around a 20-minute conversation that I'm going to have with Kevin around organised crime, and then we've got the opportunity to address the questions that you might have at that point. I've mentioned Kevin. Can I say that he is the Assistant Director at His Majesty's Revenue and Customs, and he has a rich experience leading financial investigation, asset recovery, and policy and strategy in the context of international organised crime. Kevin, thank you very much for joining me today for this conversation.
Thank you very much, Tim, for the invite. Delighted to be here.
So, can I begin by asking maybe the obvious question? When we're thinking about a customs authority, we don't perhaps immediately think about organised crime. We're more comfortable with tax, revenue, and that kind of activity. But of course, your role within customs is very much focused at a strategic level on the organised crime threat.
Yeah, I think we're quite lucky. As you say, in most circumstances, people would consider a customs administration to maybe deal with customs matters through administrative measures, maybe using customs powers, but I think we're quite unique in that we are one of a few tax, revenue and customs authorities to have criminal investigation capability. And we're also, for our sins, one of 25 anti-money laundering supervisors in the UK, so that brings with it a number of challenges as well. And so I think it's, given the size and scale of the problem, so I think just this week we published a revised tax gap that assessed criminal attacks to cost the revenue 4.4 billion. That's a substantial amount of money. That's a substantial amount of organised crime activity. And so I think it's only appropriate that we as the Revenue and Customs Authority have investigative functionality to deal with that. And that's complemented by quite a robust and quite a mature intelligence capability as well. So, in effect, we're able to identify and consume our own organised crime smoke, so to speak. But, in addition to criminal capability, we have civil investigatory powers, not least kind of those that are enshrined in tax and customs law, but also we're able to draw on things like the Proceeds of Crime Act, the Insolvency Act. So with a degree of boast, I'd say we have some of the broadest powers in terms of domestic law enforcement agencies, particularly in that asset recovery and confiscation space.
And some of the biggest responsibilities, arguably, as well. I mean, you're just picking up on that point around you're one of 25 supervisors. From recollection, I think you're the supervisor that picks up everything else that none of the other supervisors. And very often they're really challenging.
Yeah. So if they're not supervised by a professional body, for example, the ICA or someone like that, and they are an accountant or they provide accountancy services, then they would fall to HMRC as the default supervisor. So, in effect, that could be people doing the accounts for the local residents association would be required to register with HMRC for AML purposes. So real variations in terms of complexity of business offering. But also we have sectors like trust and company service providers, again, independent of those managed by professional bodies, and money service businesses, including informal value transfer service providers. So, a real breadth of kind of DNFPBs, but also, those that are considered financial institutions, each of which have a different business model, each of which have different compliance risks, and each of which require different education and engagement.
So going back to the organised crime challenge, you mentioned an eye-watering figure, £4.4 billion. I wonder, could you unpack that a little? What does that represent?
So I think most tax administrations do this, but certainly we've been doing it for some time, is obviously assessing the tax gap in terms of how much money is owed versus how much is collected. And then we're able to kind of, using a range of robust analytical techniques, kind of stratify that by types of behavior. So in this case, we call criminal attacks. And that's kind of spread across a variety of regime risks. So, for a long time, tobacco smuggling has been kind of high on our agenda in terms of organised crime exploitation, alcohol fraud, missing trader intra-community, albeit that's kind of transitioned into VAT supply chain fraud, organised labour fraud, and then repayments fraud. So that's where you see large-scale attacks on the repayment system, essentially claiming monies that people aren't owed, and there's an element of organised criminality that sits around that. And there's a real, across all of those threat areas, there's a real mix of domestic and international threat or capability, rather. So criminals based wherever they may be, looking to attack the tax system, maybe using VPNs and others to mask where they're based, but kind of essentially giving the impression that they're based in the UK. And then what I and my team do is look at all of those threats holistically and try and identify the main money laundering methods that sit behind them. So that could be cash-based money laundering, tech-enabled, trade-based money laundering. So tech-enabled money laundering, not tech-enabled trade-based money laundering, priority money launderers, and then, as I said, that kind of risk within our supervised sector, which is HMRC threat agnostic. You can have drug traffickers using MSBs to launder the proceeds of crime, organised immigration crime, and the link to IVTS. So that kind of broadens our remit even further to look at things that aren't traditionally considered assigned matters.
I'd like to come back to the money laundering that you've touched upon, but before I do, you've described a variety of different forms of organised crime, including MTIC. Now, I'm guessing that many who are joining us today, and who will at some point in the future watch the recordings, may be new to that form of crime. I also know from experience it's not particularly easy to explain, but I wonder if you could attempt to do
Thanks,
that.
Tim. So I guess the kind of easiest way to think about it, and I'm going to use quite a historic example because that was kind of what defined MTIC for much of the mid-2000s, was the movement of mobile phones. And particularly when we were in the EU, and then that kind of creating opportunities for firms within a supply chain, and there were a number of firms in effect transferring mobile phones between them within seconds almost of being the importer, and then all of a sudden 2 or 3 seconds later they were an exporter to another business in a supply chain, and then kind of claiming the VAT for that purchase or for that sale as the product carousels round, as it goes round this kind of supply chain. And then the person at the end of the supply chain, in effect, would owe that money to HMRC, that kind of consolidated VAT debt. And so that's where you get the missing trader pieces. Then they would disappear from the supply chain entirely. And then HMRC is kind of left without that payment over. And so thanks to some changes in legislation, we've been able to kind of increase the liability within the supply chain. So rather than one missing trader being responsible, you can kind of look along the supply chain and assert, usually through a civil process, of kind of an element of joint and several liability that you should have known, you should have taken due diligence steps almost in a way. So that kind of was a real game changer in terms of mitigating the risk. But hopefully that's given the listeners and viewers today a bit of a sense of what that risk looks like.
So in summary, it picks up on the fact that an exporter of, let's say, mobile phones, who has paid VAT on those, but is unable to recover that VAT because they're selling overseas, it recognises that they then can claim against the Exchequer, effectively, for a repayment of that VAT. Now, that works if within that series of transactions, that supply chain, someone has actually paid the VAT. But essentially what the criminals are able to do is exploit that chain, and in such a way that no one has actually paid the VAT,
exactly,
but nonetheless it's being refunded.
Yes.
And of course, vast amounts of money historically been raised by the criminal community in this way. And there's a success story in this. Yeah, and we were talking about this before the transmission, and it recognises that because you've understood the threat, you've been able to lobby the government to change the legislation, to identify and address the weakness. So it's now, I'm not sure if you'd say it's fallen off a cliff in terms of the levels, but it's certainly a significantly reduced
Yes.
threat?
In terms of management of the risk, it's much more sustainable in the sense of the action we take now. We're not trying to kind of put out multiple fires as was happening in the kind of early 2000s. Now it's much more sustainable in the sense of we know what sectors they operate in, what kind of actors they are, what kind of methodologies they use, and then we can apply some of those civil procedures that we've kind of alluded to sort of bear down on that activity. And of course, as much as the UK has exited the EU, work in tandem with our European partners. Often times have copied the UK's kind of legal approach in terms of zero rating certain products that were at higher risk of MTech exploitation, taking away that incentive to rip off the exchequer in Italy, in France, in the UK.
And the other forms of organised crime that you touched upon pick up on some of the same issues. Import duty, where on tobacco, alcohol, there's a requirement to pay certain, and again, I'm a little bit unclear about what this looks like. How are criminals exploiting that? Is it simply, for instance, that they are subverting the process in such a way that they're not paying the required customs fees, or what does that look like?
So in alcohol, that's kind of the primary sort of methodology where you have a degree of what's called alcohol diversion. So where it's claimed that an alcohol is moving from one bonded warehouse to another, and it kind of remains in a sort of customs duty-free space, if you can picture that, like a kind of very small sort of independent space within a country that doesn't necessarily attract customs duties, and then it may move back into the EU or make its way into another supply chain, and then the VAT is reconciled or the duties are reconciled in due course. That is diverted away from there and just finds its way into shops or wherever else it might do, and is kind of sold under the counter or is integrated into that business, but obviously none of the correct duties have been paid. In the context of tobacco, it is slightly different, where you have the production of kind of product that doesn't have a natural home in the UK, which is predominantly dominated by the big four tobacco companies and the traditional brands you see in most newsagents and wherever else. So you'll kind of have what's known as cheap whites. So essentially could taste the same in terms of the tobacco blend that's within them, but they'll have a different form of packaging. They're not associated to any of the big four. And so then they are introduced, smuggled into the UK, and then sold at a discounted rate. So rather than paying, I don't know how much tobacco is these days, but rather than paying £20 for a packet of cigarettes, let's say, someone in the pub approaches you with a pack that looks broadly similar to the brand that you smoke, but they're offering it for £10. So, you've got that double-edged element of kind of losing the duties, but also losing the VAT that would be applicable on top of, a legitimate product. And then obviously the manufacturers are losing out as well as they're seeing their market share compromised.
So for any smokers that happen to be joining us today, an obvious question is there a health risk in smoking cigarettes of that nature?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean...
Well, there's always a health risk in smoking cigarettes, but does it go beyond that?
I mean, in that sense, actually, for those manufacturers of cheap whites, they're not looking to kind of compromise by putting in, all manner of ingredients because they want to kind of sustain a market share. Whereas maybe in things like alcohol, where you've got kind of, illicit alcohol being produced, and we have had instances of that in the UK, you're not quite sure what's in the mix. So there's very much a health and safety risk, not only for the people producing the illicit alcohol, and we've heard of stills exploding because it's just so volatile, but also then, what's being drunk thereafter by people. But the kind of that level of risk isn't to the same extent as you might see in the sense of illicit tobacco or these cheap whites being produced, but ultimately they are good quality because they want to impose in on a market and generate profit that way. It's not in their interest to kill their customers, I guess is the way I describe it.
So can I go back to the reference that you made to money laundering that, of course, underpins organised crime? Sometimes we lose sight of the fact that we focus on money laundering for good reason, not just because we're required to, because there's an international expectation, but because it funds, it enables, and it incentivizes organised crime. If we could be more effective in countering the money laundering threat, then ultimately that will reduce the harm caused by organised crime. Sorry, I'm on my own little hobby horse there. And
absolutely.
I think you can very easily lose sight of that.
Tim, preach it.
Thank you very much. But you talked about three particular types of money laundering. I know that you just gave them as examples, but one was around cash, a second was around trade-based money laundering, and a third, you talked about tech-enabled. I wonder whether we could just spend a few minutes unpacking each of those. So what are you seeing in terms of cash-based money laundering?
That includes cash proxies as well. So as much as it's kind of physical cash on a person, and there's an obvious association with some of the threats I mentioned, like tobacco and alcohol, where you've got sale of an illicit or restricted product that generates cash, that's consolidated and maybe moves back along the same supply chain that brought the product in the first place. So concealments in a lorry, concealments in a van, whatever it looks like. So there still is an element of physical cash movement, and that's kind of borne out by a National Assessment Centre product from a couple of years ago that kind of estimated the value as around 12 billion is cash-based money laundering. And that's not just excise. So alcohol and tobacco are known as excise risks, but that includes modern slavery, human trafficking, and drug trafficking. But we're also seeing a growth and an exploitation of gold, not least because the value of gold is quite significant. And so you've kind of got a dual element to it. It's an alternative store of value. You know, one gold bar probably is the equivalent of £5,000 or £6,000, depending on its size and its purity and everything else. But as a means of moving value, it's quite effective. You've got a kind of potential trade-based money laundering risk in that as well, where it's been under-declared. So someone says it's 9-carat gold when actually it's 22-carat gold, and there's approximately 50 or 60,000 pounds in the difference of 1 kilogram of each. So as a way of just, moving a lot more value than has been stated. There's a duties element to this as well. So in effect, people can, under what's known as the outward processing release scheme, move gold, so scrap gold, let's say, from the UK to another jurisdiction to be repurposed into jewellery. They can limit the amount of duties and VAT they pay. And the only value they pay on is then what's been added to that. So if it's had rubies and other, jewellery added to it, they'll be liable for a relatively small amount of duties rather than the full amount. So we see a lot of exploitation of that scheme. There's obviously a sanctions intersection as well, because the UK imposed trade sanctions on Russia following its invasion of Ukraine, including not allowing Russian gold into the UK bullion market. So there's a kind of real interesting challenge there. Like, how do you validate the provenance of gold? Where's it come from? Has it been sourced sustainably? So that's kind of cash-based money laundering. That also includes monies in bank accounts as well. So that's where we use some of our powers under the Proceeds of Crime Act called AFOs, account freezing orders. Tech-enabled kind of broadly covers two spheres. So the exploitation of crypto assets, which is obviously of long-standing interest to law enforcement, because it enables all manner of things like fraud as well as its money laundering value. And then the kind of criminal exploitation of electronic money institutions, or what might technically be known as non-banking payment service providers. And there's a real, to kind of draw on Russia again, there's a real kind of Russian doll element to that, where you've got maybe a criminally complicit EMI based in a jurisdiction that's then kind of partnering with another EMI based in another jurisdiction that might not have robust AML controls, and then kind of up the supply chain until there's a footprint in the UK. And throughout, each person is doing due diligence on their customer. So the EMI in the UK that's maybe hosting these EMIs is not necessarily thinking about, well, who's at the bottom of the supply chain and what are they doing?
So it's a nested arrangement.
Exactly okay. Right. And then when you add in virtual IBANs to that, which can then add further complexity and challenge, you've got a real opportunity to launder almost without any oversight. And you're kind of ensconced in the regulated sector. So it kind of gives it that validation. There's a third strand to our TEML work, albeit it's kind of emerging.
TEML?
Sorry, tech-enabled money laundering.
Okay.
Is obviously everyone's talking about it, and why wouldn't we? Is artificial intelligence, both as an enabler of tax crime, but also as a potential support to law enforcement or our compliance work overall. And I don't know, there's been a lot of work being done by colleagues in the National Crime Agency. How can we introduce AI to help with the drafting of court orders, for example, which can then save investigators time, because they can be very time consuming and very detailed. So those are the kind of areas around tech-enabled. And then trade-based money laundering, I mean...
You've started to touch on this already, haven't you? Because you talked about gold.
Yeah. But you can look at that. I mean, we're having this conversation yesterday, actually, with colleagues from France and other European customs partners. Is TBML a particularly helpful term anyway? is it trade-enabled financial crime? Because whether it's TBML or not, and you can get really purist about it, if there's suspicious trade activity, there's probably customs duties exploitation. There could be sanctions evasion. There could be the smuggling of illicit and restricted goods. So just looking at trade exploitation is a good thing to do because it could open other opportunities. But we're taking a multi-agency, multi-sectoral approach to TBML, obviously partnering with the public and private sector, both domestically and internationally. And gold, again, is one of the commodities that we're certainly looking as to how it can be used as a TBML enabler or a trade exploitation enabler. But I would encourage people that are listening to the webinar, if you speak to your FIU, your financial intelligence unit in your country, if you're not based in the UK, albeit if you are based in the UK as well, Egmont, the Egmont group of financial intelligence units did a really interesting piece of work a couple of years ago on TBML as to how SARS, STRs can help identify suspicious activity. They put together a playbook of case studies, including services-based money laundering, which is a whole other area of risk, but also, associations with bribery and corruption. And so FIUs are meant to make that available to reporting entities. So if you're kind of unsure of TBML and would like some more insight as to how STRs and SARs that you are filing are valuable, please get in touch with your FIU and harass them to let you have sight of that Egmont report.
There's so much contained in what you've just said that I want to pick up on.
I'll take a breath.
We do need to come to some really interesting questions that have been raised. Before I do, though, can I just pick up on two things that you touched on? The first, where you talked about the movement of cash back up the supply chain. And if I understand it correctly, you were talking about the same supply chain that could have, for instance, provided the drugs that's generated that cash. Now, that for me is new. I've not seen that. I know we've got some common history in terms of our experience in dealing with international money laundering. What I tended to see, for instance, was cocaine coming out of Colombia, across the Atlantic, into West Africa, up into Europe, but then cash being collected, and then that cash going on a very different route, typically to places like Singapore, Hong Kong, Dubai, where it's consolidated, and eventually that debt would be reconciled back in Colombia. And then you'll recognise that, but I've not heard this type of cash going back up the same supply chain before, and so for me that's fascinating. Is there much evidence of that, or
certainly with tobacco smuggling, because you've kind of got your ready-made, someone's brought the product in the first place, so they've already been convinced of the value of doing that. That could be because money has changed hands. It's just as easy then, like you're going out in your lorry, why not take a bag full of cash? And unsurprisingly, many drivers are like, I have no idea how this got into my cab. It's like, well, someone stashed it under a chair, so you must have had some idea. And that
felt a bit lumpy.
Indeed, exactly. Like I'll have to adjust the seat setting, but it just makes it easier because inevitably there's a concealment already been used to bring the product in the first place.
I'm with you,
So why not just recycle that and put it back through again? And as much as there's opportunity in that cash consolidation point where that's like a accounting house or something like that, as soon as it's kind of into that sort of trade movement process, no one wants to shut down Dover Port for all day, every day, checking every lorry that goes through to see whether or not there's a concealment. So you have to kind of be very intelligent, very targeted around some of that, and ideally try and take it further up the supply chain, as in where it's being consolidated, because then inevitably you get your larger amounts as well. So I'm not saying it's unique to tobacco and alcohol smuggling, but we certainly see that just because you've got that supply chain in place.
That's really interesting. Now, I was going to ask you about your reference to artificial intelligence-enabled tax crime, but we're running short of time, and we have got some questions. So can I come to those now? So many thanks to colleagues who have raised some questions. So Ala Shadid, and please forgive me if I've pronounced your name badly, but you make the point around cross-border organised crime becoming more complex. How do customs agencies coordinate with international partners? It's an important question. It's a big challenge, isn't it?
Yeah, 100%. I mean, as I mentioned earlier, we had this conversation yesterday with colleagues from France and the Netherlands and Ireland and Italy, and all of us, talked about the need for cooperation, but also the fact that there are barriers that prohibit, genuinely dynamic sharing of intelligence. in a real-time way. Some of it can be retrospective, some of it requires a formal legal process that you and I understand as mutual legal assistance or international letters of request. That system itself is very clunky. And so, I've heard colleagues in the Guards from Ireland describe criminals moving at the speed of finance and everyone else moving at the speed of law. And sometimes there's a real discrepancy there. So I think it's kind of, this terrible term that's become vernacular now, but what is the art of the possible in the context of how can we maybe work around some of these legal hurdles? So ourselves and colleagues from other agencies in the UK have liaison officers based overseas. They can often be a really good facilitator of that initial conversation. There are provisions within law that allows for intelligence-only disseminations. So if nothing else, you're at least building that picture of shared concern, and then you might have to move into a more formal setting. And then we are really keen to push, the value of public-private partnerships. I know they are used, they're the solution to all manner of ills, but I think we're in a position now globally where everyone's looking at how we take this across borders. And so we have something at the moment looking at TBML, which is a multinational public-private partnership. It's virtual. It remains very much in the kind of insight space. There's no dynamic intelligence sharing, but it feels like that's a really positive step in the right direction. So there are various channels, but absolutely right to say that, the future will be defined by closer cooperation across the board.
And trying to overcome some of the real and important obstacles around working internationally. For instance, the evidential standard.
Absolutely.
I remember if I wanted evidence on a fraud inquiry, for instance, from a particular jurisdiction, it might take 2 years to source that and go through all the correct channels, where, of course, criminals are able to operate more or less instantly.
Absolutely.
And so, of course, they exploit that. Thank you. There's one or two questions that focus on AI. I'm not going to turn to those other than to say that next Wednesday, I'm going to be talking to a experienced AI expert in this space. And please join us for that conversation, because we're going to address some of the questions that have been raised on this issue. But what I would like to do is come to Vikash, one of your questions around trade misinvoicing in the context of cross-border money laundering. Now, you've touched on that, of course, because we've been talking about trade-based money laundering. Given that there's this particular interest in this, how easy is this for the criminals to exploit our international trade systems and channels? I would say, actually, it kind of lends itself. Whether you look at it in terms of the goods themselves, and you mentioned only a tiny proportion are actually, as they travel around the world, are actually inspected by customs authorities. Looking at it from the banking perspective, it's very difficult for them to know what physically is being moved.
Yep.
Is that a fair characterization?
Yeah, absolutely. Because 80% of all trade is facilitated through open account finance, as in an importer pays an exporter maybe 30 or 60 or 90 days after receiving the goods. So there's no trade finance element, and there's no explicit oversight for an institution that might demand to see a bill of lading and also other forms of documentary collection, as they would if they were offering trade finance services. If you're in a jurisdiction that's relatively easy to set up a company, and that has a kind of history of maybe trading, you're kind of in a nice space to start exploiting that, whether that's invoice recycling, as in the same invoice again and again and again, but the only thing that changes is the date. If you are really worth your salt, and I'm not wishing to give anyone ideas here by any stretch, this isn't a TED talk about how to launder money, why would you even bother buying product? You can just make it a purely paper-based exercise. You can establish companies in jurisdictions perhaps with lack of beneficial ownership transparency. So getting behind that UBO is almost impossible. And because it's facilitated through open account, you've got a nice enclosed, relatively discrete money laundering methodology. Now, that comes down, that's like a house of cards. It can come down fairly quickly if there is an intervention from a customs administration, like checking the bill of lading with the shipping container and finding it empty. But, ultimately you're hiding in a huge volume of trade transactions that happen every day. And so, and because law enforcement is intelligence-led, we need that kind of seed to know where to look. So if you were clever enough and kept kind of relatively modest, it could be quite an effective way. Again, not that Kevin Newe or HMRC is endorsing trade-based money laundering by any stretch, but it just shows the complexity of the threat.
But it does illustrate the importance of effective due diligence.
Absolutely.
Within banks, payment providers, and other similar organisations. And for those of us, of course, that are involved in that, the question is, does it make sense?
Yeah.
You know, the nature of this trade, the volume,
Yes.
the products, do they make sense in the markets,
100%.
within the supply chain context, and so on?
Yeah, the colleagues in the Netherlands have exactly that. They call it know your sector. So to combine with know your customer, who is operating in that space, do we expect to see, and this is slightly cliched admittedly, like do we expect to see 10 million tulips moving from Amsterdam to wherever in the volume and the frequency that we see? Is there something not right there? And oftentimes that can be the thing that exposes criminals, is they kind of run before they can walk.
Yes.
They start off small and then all of a sudden it's volumes that just don't make sense, as kind of happened in MTIC, speaking back to that. But those are the kind of areas where you see that real discrepancy. Or, you know, they're selling tulips one day, but then they're selling like, you know, bespoke heavy machinery the next. It's like that's a hell of a diversification there. Those two don't feel like they sit together.
No. Okay. We could go on.
We could. I could certainly go
but
on.
Our 30 minutes is up. Kevin, I'm going to invite you in a moment just to offer any closing thoughts before we finish. But before I do that, can I thank you, for wherever you are in the world, for joining us today, or for listening to the recording at some future time. I hope this has been of value and of interest. We will continue similar conversations every second and fourth Wednesday. And Kevin, I do hope I can persuade you to come back for a similar conversation in the future. But any final thought from you?
Yeah, I often, you know, like to kind of close on something a former colleague of mine who now works in a bank has described this as a leadership challenge. So Linda Hamilton, that you and I both know, which I think is absolutely right. We can get bogged down in like, what's the process, what's the policy, what's the requirement, as well we should, because there's legal jeopardy if we don't. But like, if we get this right, we can have profound and immeasurable impacts on people's lives, making things better for them, whether that's fraud, whether that's money laundering. You've already spoken about the harms. And a real good challenge that Linda always leaves her audience with, and I'm shamelessly stealing this with pride, is if we're doing the same things we did 5 years ago, the gap is only going to get wider. And I'm sure people feel frustrated, whether that's our SARs being used, is law enforcement doing what we need them to do, all of which are legitimate challenges. But I think the more we can have very transparent and very pragmatic conversations with each other, I think that can only be a good thing. So, you know, I know there are loads of fora that allow that to happen, whether in the UK or elsewhere. I think we really need to kind of challenge ourselves as to how the system can be more effective.
I agree with Linda. I agree with yourself, Kevin. And I think I'd add more to that in saying that it's leadership at every level.
Yes.
At a global, national, regulatory and organisation level as well. And that we could actually say is quite exciting.
Yes, I think so.
As well as presenting a challenge.
Think so.
Kevin, thank you once again
for
joining me. It's been a pleasure. And thank you wherever you are in the world today.